Now you might be asking why I'm talking about perspective in side-scrollers. We obviously just see stuff from the side. Well, that is kind of true, but the problem we might run into when we make our game art is that the world might start feeling a bit flat if everything is in side view. Suppose we want to add a door or a portal. This type of door looks flat. Even if we open it, it still looks flat and boring. So this is generally the reason why we're inclined to add some perspective. But suppose we make a door like this in order to add some depth. Now our door looks fine on its own, but together with our platform, this looks off. Now our perspective doesn't make sense. We're clearly looking at the platform from the side, but the door from above. So it's important to think about our perspective and how to make our perspective look consistent. So to start off, you'll sometimes see the standard side-scroller view called an orthographic side view. This is a kind of complicated name for a rather simple thing. If you were to look at two boxes in a 3D software like Blender, and I start my camera here, I can see a little bit of this side of the box and a lot on this side. If I now pan the camera, the entire left side of the box starts disappearing, and if I pan it far enough, I'll see the right side of the box. But if I draw a box asset, I can't do this. There are no sides to the box. All you can see is what I drew. When I pan the camera, I only want to keep seeing what I actually drew. And well, you can do this in Blender if you click on a little thing called Orthographic camera. Now when I pan, I always see the same side of the box. Nothing else. So because this is the view you get when you do an orthographic side view projection of a 3D object, some people do like calling this an orthographic side view. But I kind of want to stress that this terminology makes it all seem more rigorous than it actually is. It's true that for our actual platforms, we can't use normal perspective, because we draw 2D sprites that we cannot change when the camera pans. And orthographic projections don't change as you pan, which makes them perfect for side-scrollers. But if you look at what happens in my 3D software, if I place one box up close here and one really far back, and then I go into my orthographic side view, well, now the boxes are the exact same size. This is weird. We don't want this. If we look at a normal scene in a game, we want the tree that is close to us to look bigger than the tree further back. But the problem is that an orthographic projection doesn't scale with distance. So we're kind of stuck with an inherent problem. We want some qualities of orthographic projections and some qualities of normal perspective. And so what do? Well, we just use the things we want. After all, we just want things to look good. And this is how to make things look good. But I want to stress here that I don't really like framing it as if we're using this orthographic projection. It makes it seem rigorous. What we're doing is making an asset that looks kind of orthographic, because it looks good. So while I will talk a bit about projections and how to make things look kind of correct, I want you to understand from the outset that none of this is correct. We're just mimicking correctness. When we do side-scroller art, we just use a mix of different projections in order to suit our needs, which often means an orthographic side view for our platforms, but a kind of pseudo-perspective view in our background. So our worry as artists isn't really about being correct, it's rather that we don't want to make things look so incorrect that someone notices it. So if we go back to our door example, if we want to create a door like this, where it looks as if we're looking down on our door, we should generally also have a platform with the same kind of view. We also need to look down on our platform. This version looks weird, but this looks kind of correct. And obviously this isn't that strange of a view, we see it in games like Blasphemous. But I want to go back to thinking about our side view platform for a moment. Suppose our game is platform heavy, and we need to have our platforms in side view. How should we make our doors in this side view? Well, what a lot of games do is continue with orthographic projections. If we look at what happens if I have lots of weird boxes stacked on each other quite randomly, and then I go into my orthographic side view, we can see this. Now I can see these sides here, and if I draw on top of this 3D model, well, we get this. It looks kind of nice. You can also see that this is the view you would see for boxes in games like Ender Lilies. So what is the difference between this side view, this orthographic or axonometric side view, and our normal perspective? In normal perspective, we could also see the sides. Well, the problem that generally occurs in normal perspective is that we have to draw a horizon line. And then all lines we draw have to converge toward a vanishing point on that horizon line. So if I draw these boxes in perspective, it looks nice. But if I stick these boxes on my side view platform, now I get this gap here, like as if my box is weirdly just floating in the air. This doesn't make sense. If you compare this with our orthographic boxes, these sidelines are just kept straight and parallel with each other. And if we place these boxes on our platform, it fits perfectly. It looks as if the boxes are on the platform. As mentioned, this side view is also easy to create. We just extend this line out a bit, completely horizontal. So our depth axis, our Z axis, completely overlaps our X axis. And I can add this to any object I make. I can take the door, just extend the line a bit, and now it looks as if the door has a bit more depth. The same thing happens if we want to add a box in our angled side scroller. I can't add this side view box, but I can add one where it looks as if we're looking down on it. Now if the box isn't connected to anything, and just free floating, then obviously you can use either box. It just looks like a slightly rotated object. But if the box is connected to a slightly top-down platform, then you need a slightly top-down box. And if you connect the box to a side view platform, then you need a box that you're also looking at from the side. This is generally the approach you would see if you take a look at any platformer. Look at this bench in Hollow Knight. You see it slightly from the side, but it looks kind of reasonable. So this makes it seem as if we're clearly dealing with an orthographic projection for a platformer. Perspective boxes clearly look weird. And this is kind of true, but the problem with this type of perspective view is that it doesn't connect to the platform. But okay, what happens if I lower my angle on the boxes in Blender so that these bottom lines are almost parallel? Well, now it connects, but it still looks bad. So we still can't use it. But if I now zoom out on my object in Blender and look at it from far away, well, now these lines start looking less distorted, and if I draw this type of box, now it looks good. Potentially even better than my orthographic boxes. If we compare all these boxes, we can see that these two are clearly bad, but these two could be used somewhat interchangeably. Both look good. They're different projections, but we're already mixing our projections anyway. We only care about what looks good. So how do we create the vanishing point for an asset like this? Well, we kind of don't. We don't have a real vanishing point. We just push in the sides a bit to add some depth. And we do that until we feel that it looks good. So we see games like Iconoclasts mix their projections in this kind of way. This is a side view on our platform, but this house is pointing toward a vanishing point. So we partly have a orthographic side view and partly have a normal perspective. Same thing happens to this box in Greek. It's just normal perspective. And I've actually done this already in this video. In an orthographic projection, all lines need to be parallel and shouldn't join up at the vanishing point. But this door doesn't follow that rule. Given the projection rules I put forth, this door should have parallel lines and thus look like this. But I prefer the design of this door, so I made the door this way. Once again, we care about what looks good, which means that not only do we not care about keeping a consistent projection, we don't even necessarily care about keeping a consistent side view angle. Suppose you have a side view platform. What happens if I add a vase like this? Now, does this look bad? You're technically seeing this vase from a slight top-down angle. The vase from a side view should look like this. But once again, in many cases this looks bad design-wise. So you might opt for the inaccurate but cuter version. You can quite often see Hollow Knight do this. As I said, we would generally not get this rounded edge if we see it from a side view. But it doesn't feel too wrong, and it looks decent, so it works. Similarly with this barrel here in Greek. It's angled weirdly if we consider that it's placed on the platform. It should be straight, but it isn't. Now what happens when we draw more complex shapes? How does our projection work? Well, once again, you can get away with inaccuracy. Take a pillar like this. Is the projection correct? Is it orthographic or perspective? Is the shape even logical? I honestly don't know, and I drew this. I don't know if this object would work in 3D. I didn't draw it in 3D. It doesn't look too incorrect, at least I didn't notice it being incorrect. So I guess it works. If we look at this pillar I made in Blender, here we see it in perspective view and here in orthographic. If you saw this pillar in game, I don't think you would be able to tell which projection was used. And I don't think you would be able to tell if this was accurate. In my previous top-down video, I talked about oblique projections and axonometric projections and how to keep the angle consistent and about using the same foreshortening factors. I don't care about that when I do side-scroller art. I just pick an angle that feels roughly correct and then I draw. What I want to say with this is that I think it's important to not get paralyzed by the fact that you don't know how it should look. Just do something, and if the error is so bad it becomes obvious, I mentioned this in my video before, people will point it out. And you might be thinking that I'm just being lazy by saying just don't make errors so bad it's noticeable, but once again, you kind of have to accept some errors. And this idea of not making your errors too noticeable is actually something you can use to your advantage. Take a look at these platforms in Blasphemous. We see a bit of the top of the platforms, but this edge here is completely vertical. But if we look at what happens at the cobblestone on the actual platform, it's super messy, with a lot of shifting 3D looking rocks. And we can't easily tell if this is an orthographic or perspective view. Since all these rocks are angled kind of weirdly, we can't notice or see sort of a correct vanishing point. We can't measure this out. And I think this is in part intentional. You can obscure correctness by creating a mess. Even further than this, perspective projection tends to only look weird because we expect objects to change if we move the camera. But if we don't move the camera, well then we can use normal perspective as much as we want. It's as if we're painting a painting. And if we can get away with perspective, we tend to try and get away with perspective. It often looks more natural. I think this is part of the reason why we sometimes see house designs like these in Itora. There's no way for me to at a glance notice if something is off here. There's so many weird shapes in this house that when I see it, I mainly think that this is a weird but kind of cool looking house. But look at what happens if I draw a red house using an axonometric side view projection. It looks kind of bad. What about if I do it in that kind of flattering perspective projection? It looks better, but it still looks bad. The design of the house isn't flattering for this type of perspective. So no matter how much perspective you add, you're not gonna fix it. You need to fix the design. And I'll actually talk about this in my next video, but I want to stress this. While adding depth through perspective is nice, it isn't as important as design. Compare this house to this one. This has depth and correct perspective, but this one is completely flat. But regardless, this house looks better. The solution to your problem isn't always about perspective. I tend to draw my assets in a rather flat manner because I find it easier. We can see Umbrella do this as well. It looks really good, but it rarely uses any type of fancy perspective. It's all just flat view of the object on the side. While perspective is a nice tool to use to add depth, a flat view often works almost equally well. Because I kind of ignored something important when I showed this door initially. Lighting. Let's look at what happens if I light this door. Well, now it doesn't look that flat. While the axonometric door perhaps looks a tad bit nicer still, the biggest jump in quality came from lighting the door. So I personally think it's important to think of perspective as a tiny little tool you have to make things nicer. Sometimes you want to add an axonometric side view bench, other times you want to use perspective, and another time you work on the design. You always want to pick what happens to look best. It needs to look good, but not necessarily correct. We can even see some games like Rayman throw correctness out the window. But it does it so consistently that it looks intentional. Because it is intentional. Not that I recommend that you do this. Blasphemous does the same thing, but mixing stuff to this extent, while also making it look good, is actually quite tricky. So with that said, feel free to support me on Patreon. I release unscripted videos there, along with some free content on occasion. Thanks for watching. Bye.